Hi. So in our last discussion, we looked at how life originated on this planet, and then we said that we are going to look at what happens to be one of the most interesting topics in evolutionary biology for many people, which is how exactly did humans evolve. So whatever you're going to see is primarily based on information from Fukuyama and Kirkpatrick, but I have also ended up including inputs from many other sources. So if you remember our last discussion, we left at Luca, and from Luca we had the formation of the eukaryotes. Now, of course, between origin of life and humans, many other traits ended up evolving. So, eukaryotes formed here, then at some points we had the formation of multicellular organisms, nerves and muscles. So, here I am showing you how many million years ago, roughly speaking, those changes happened. So, dorsal nerve cord happened, bones came into the picture, legs, limbs evolved, amniotic egg evolved, placenta evolved, and then somewhere around 70 million years ago or so, many mammals, including the early primates, they ended up evolving. They had binocular vision, and at some point the tail got lost about 18 million years ago, and then at some point we had all these apes coming in, and about 35 million years ago these apes, the so called the tailless primates, they arose. So here I am showing you a quick phylogenetic relationship between some of the living apes, and you can see that humans are here, and we ended up splitting from the lineage that gave rise to bonobos and chimpanzees about 7 million years ago, and this lineage that finally ended up leading to humans, this is what is known as the hominin lineage. So these two, bonobos and chimpanzees, they both of them belong to the genus Pan. Humans and all these other species, the so called hominin species, they belong to the genus Homo. Now, although it is shown as a straight line over here, the hominin lineage actually gave rise to several species, all but one of which went extinct, and that one species that survived was Homo sapiens, which is us. Okay. Now, what exactly does it mean to be a human? Now, typically this question is asked in a philosophy class, but if you ask it in a biology class, you can answer it in many different ways, and we are primarily going to look at the thing in terms of anatomy. Why anatomy? Because much of the information that we initially gathered about humans and hominin species, they were all through fossil remains, and of course fossil remains, in order to understand them, what you need to look at is the anatomy of the corresponding organisms. So here I am showing you 4 different species of apes: orangutans, gorillas, chimpanzees and humans. Now, anatomically speaking, what exactly makes us humans? So for this, what I will do is, we have some features of the human skeleton, some features of the chimpanzee skeleton, and we are going to compare them across multiple axes. So for example, if you look at humans, we are obligate bipedal locomotion, that is what we have, which basically means we walk on 2 legs, whereas apes, they walk on all 4. So that is what is called quadrupedalism, and in their case, when they are typically walking on the land, they walk with the help of their knuckles, what you see over here. Okay, so this is what is known as knuckle walking, and the other thing that they do is they swing from branch to branch, which is what known as brachiation. And when these guys, chimpanzees and other apes, when they walk, typically their posture is semi-erect. They are not erect like us. They are somewhat, as you can see over here in the skeleton, this is what is known as a semi-erect posture. Now, this evolution of bipedalism was a very important feature, in the hominin lineage, and it is thought that it ended up freeing our hands for carrying and tool use, which was very important. And also, it allowed us to come down from the trees and essentially walk on the land, which meant that we were exploring into a different niche altogether. And this bipedal motion, it allowed us to be energy efficient in terms of traveling on land for long distances. Similarly, if you look at the human spine, so that the human spine is S-shaped. So there is one curvature over here, in the thoracic region, and another curvature over here in the lumbar region. Whereas if you look at the chimpanzee's spine, it is more or less straight or slightly bent. It's C-shaped kind of. Now, what is the advantage of that? The primary advantage of that is that this S shape, it acts as a nice shock absorber. So when you are walking, completely erect without the help of your knuckles, then each time you are stepping forward, there is a shock that is coming to your body through the legs, and this spinal cord, this in the spine rather, it actually ends up acting as a nice shock absorber. More importantly, this S shape, it takes the weight of our torso and places it over the center of gravity of the body, which happens to be around the pelvic region, and this very nice positioning of the center of gravity allows us to be very stable when we are walking upright. Then if you look at our pelvis, we have this broad but short bowl shaped pelvis, whereas look at the pelvis of a chimpanzee, you can see that it is somewhat narrower and longer and flatter. Okay. Now, what is the implication of this? The implication is that those bowl shape, it actually supports the internal organs much better, and more importantly, it gives a much better space for the butt muscles, the so-called gluteal muscles, to anchor, which allows us to walk much better, and particularly in the context of an upright stance. So that's a huge change and difference from the apes. Then if you look at our legs and arms, in humans, as you can see, our arms are shorter, our legs are longer. In the apes, it is the other way around. So this allows this longer legs and arms. This is much better in terms of having a striding gait like this, whereas for the apes, their longer arms is much better in terms of their swinging from the trees. So it's pretty obvious that their skeleton is more suitable for a life in the trees, whereas our skeleton is more suitable for running and walking on land. Then if you look at our femur, the bone of the thigh, then there is a curvature in this bone. Okay, this curvature, this is known as the valgus angle. And whereas if you look at how this thing operates, they don't have that curvature. This is much straighter, it's vertical. Now, because of this curvature in the thigh bone, this actually ends up bringing our knees and the feet below, directly below our center of gravity. And when that happens, because of that, we are able to walk straight like this. Whereas if you have ever seen a gorilla or a chimpanzee walking, you would see it walks like this. Okay, like this. It kind of turns the body like this, and that is happening precisely because it has to continuously adjust the center of gravity, because its thigh is not angled the way our thigh is, or the thigh bone is not angled the way our thigh bone is. So that's about the femur, this bone here and this bone here. Then if you look at our feet, okay, this is the hand. Here you can see that our the finger, this thumb, is opposable, and the same is in the context of the feet of the apes, the chimpanzees. There this thumb is opposable and it is like this. However, if you look at our feet, human feet, then this actually has traveled all the way over here like this, and this big toe, the so-called hallux, it is non-opposable in humans. However, human beings, our feet is typically also arched like this, and this archedness allows many of us, I mean there are a few people who are flat footed, but mostly people have that arch, and that arch actually again acts as a shock absorber, and it again allows us to jump much better. On the other hand, apes, they are completely flat footed, but they have an opposable big toe. So, what is the significance? So, the arch, as I pointed out, in the humans it acts as a spring, a shock absorbing. Also, it allows better propulsion when you are putting one feet and then putting all your weight on that and putting the other feet forward. So, this springiness allows you to do that much better. I mean, ask a flat footed person the kind of problem they have. And the second thing is that if you look at the apes, this opposable big toe, that is very good for them for grasping the branches. We are not good climbers like that. The best we can do is grasp the branches with our hands. They can grasp with all four limbs. Again, highlighting the point that they are much better suited for a life in the trees. We are much better suited for walking on the land. And in terms of the skull, there is something known as the foramen magnum. What is it? It's a hole in the skull through which the spinal cord exits the skull and goes into the body. Now, in the context of humans, that is located centrally over here, whereas in the context of chimpanzees and other apes, that is located at the back of the skull over here. It's not centrally located, right? So, what is the implication of this? Because this is centrally located in humans, the skull balances much better on top of our neck. So, because of that, when you are sitting like this straight, you actually don't have to put any strain on your muscles or anything to keep the skull straight like this. Whereas in the context of these guys, the apes and the others, if they have to make this skull straight, because of this position being much backward on their skull, the position of the foramen magnum, they have to put a lot more strain on their muscles in order to keep their head high, held vertically like this. So, essentially what happens is that the balance of the skull is much better because of the central position of the foramen magnum. And if you look at our cranium, we have this large rounded cranium, you can see over here, which gives a lot of space for the brain. And we also have a vertical face, our chin is prominent and our brow ridges, these things are reduced. On the other hand, in the context of the apes, their cranium, this part is much smaller, so the volume of the brain that can fit inside is much smaller. Their jaw is protruding, so called prognathism, and their brow ridges, these things are much more prominent, right? So, because of all these changes, in the context of humans, we are able to accommodate a much larger brain inside our skull, which of course is related with our greater cognitive function. Now, just to show you what is the difference between the brain size of humans and other primates. So, obviously all these primates have different body sizes, so you have to scale it by body size. So, here you have the body mass on x axis and the brain mass on y axis, and you can see that for all the other primates it lies on a reasonable non-linear regression, it kind of flattens off. But if you look at humans, compared to this regression, we have about 3x more brain, 3 to 4x more brain mass compared to all the other primates. And of course, as we know, this is a huge factor in the context of evolution of humans. Now, Darwin, again had put in a lot of thought about human evolution. In fact, although people think about the origin of species in a very big way, and of course for very good reason, Darwin himself was very proud of this book, The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, which obviously is entirely about the problem of human evolution. So Darwin made a very pertinent observation in the context of human evolution. So I am going to give you that entire quote. As usual, Darwin's sentences are a bit long, so I will break it into multiple parts so that we can comment on it. So he says that in each great region of the world, the living mammals are closely related to the extinct species of the same region, right? So this we already know, this was part of his theory. Then he says that it is therefore probable that Africa was formerly inhabited by extinct apes closely allied to the gorillas and the chimpanzees. Makes sense, right? Now comes the inference. As these two species are now man's nearest allies, which means that closest relatives in terms of anatomical features, etc., it is somewhat more probable that our early progenitors lived on the African continent than elsewhere. Okay, this is superb. Think about it. He is making a direct prediction about where human beings could have evolved. And this is slightly away from what people were thinking around that time, because many people were thinking that they must have evolved in Asia or Europe, because these were the so-called centers of long old civilizations. But he is using his observation from biogeography to make the prediction that probably it was the African continent where things humans might have evolved. And then in the same paragraph he makes the prediction that, or rather the observation that, the earth has certainly undergone many great revolutions and there has been ample time for migration on the largest scale. In other words, right at that point, 1871, Darwin is making the prediction that, look, migration is going to be a very, very important feature in the whole game. And as we are going to see, it has been a major feature. So, what do we know about evolution of the hominin group? And turns out that the answer is quite a lot. Over the last 20-30 years in particular, enormous amount of work has happened. Huge number of fossils have been discovered, enormous information has been gathered from DNA data and so on and so forth. So what I am showing you over here is from the earliest precursors of the hominin group to so this is the point where the split happens from chimpanzees, which is why here you can see y axis as time in millions of years ago, and this is what is happening around 7 million years. And then all kinds of species happen, and at some point you have this species called Homo erectus coming in, and then this Homo erectus, so this line, this branch over here in the phylogenetic tree, this branch is equal to this branch. Okay, so this branch continues to this branch, all right. And then this Homo erectus, it comes, it basically grows like this, and at some point there is a split over here. Some people think that this split over here is called Homo heidelbergensis. Other people have ended up contesting that, so we are not going into that controversy. And at some point you have modern humans, Neanderthals, etc. coming. So obviously this is a fairly complex series of things. And initially I was thinking that I am going to make a longish discussion on the evolution of these various fossil forms, but then I realized that something really interesting has happened. What is that? So 2024 happened to be the 50th anniversary of the discovery of Lucy. Now if you don't know what Lucy is or who Lucy is, doesn't matter. That's what this course is for. Okay. But just assume for the moment that there is something called Lucy, very, very important, and 2024 was the 50th anniversary of that. Now because of that, there were a series of videos that were released in 2024 celebrating the event, and some of those videos actually have done an excellent job of putting together all the information that we know, particularly in the last 15-20 years. So it is very latest. So instead of making telling you about this thing on my own, what I'm going to do is I'm going to recommend a series of 4 or 5 videos that I want you to see. So, the information content in these videos typically is not very high, but the way they do it and the people who are talking in these videos, mostly they are the topmost experts in their field, and mostly these videos have been made by some extremely reputed channels or extremely reputed organizations. So, one can be reasonably confident that whatever they are saying is scientifically accurate. Now, why am I saying this in such black and white? That is because when researching these videos, I also came across an enormous number of videos on this topic by channels that I in many cases haven't heard about, or in some cases channels which are known to be of pseudoscientific disposition. So, if you are trying to do such a search on your own, you are probably going to end up with many of those channels, and then you will end up getting information that may not necessarily agree with what we are going to talk about here, or what these videos are going to talk about. And that is one reason for which, I mean, I will obviously not prevent you from searching on your own, but I will request that you take whatever is given in these videos a little more seriously than some of the other videos that you can very easily find on this topic. So, the other important thing is that I am going to recommend that you see these videos in a particular sequence, and the sequence that I am giving you is going to tell you more or less the story as it evolved, in the sense that not as the species evolved, but in the sense of as how human beings step by step figured out the ancestry of the hominins lineage. All right. So, I personally find that to be a much more enriching and much more rewarding way of looking at this whole thing, rather than figuring out that way I gave you that tree. That is also interesting, but this is more interesting according to me. And the critical part is that the information in all these videos are a part of this course, which means that they might feature in the exams. You really need to see them. So, the first video is called the tool making animal. It is a HHMI video, and it starts with the observation that there were lots of stone tools that people were recovering in various parts of Africa. And then we go to the second video called Great Transitions, the Origin of Humans. So, this is where they talk about the work of the Leakey couple, and so they are the people who ended up discovering some of the early fossils, particularly the ones that they thought were making these tools. So, that is a slightly long video, but brilliantly made, brilliantly shot. Then the third video is, so this video talks about Lucy, it talks about the ancestors of Lucy and so on. And then this, this video, this is the discovery of Lucy is in 1974. Then, as I told you, lots of things have happened after that. So, this third video, as the name suggests, it is about all these other hominin species that we have discovered in the intervening 50 years. So, it gives you a quick overview of what the tree looks like as of 2024. As you can see, this has been commissioned by the journal Science. So, it is reasonably scientifically accurate. And finally, whatever I told you, as you can see that it will tell you about the story as it unfolded. But if you want to now sit back and look at the overall picture, then this is a brilliant 6-minute or 6.5-minute video made by the American Museum of Natural History. No voiceover, just brilliant animation, but giving you the entire story as we know of it till date. Okay. So, these 4 between them should give a very nice up to date information about what we know about this tree. Obviously, this is not everything, this is just a very broad overview, but this overview should be reasonable as far as this particular course is concerned. And after this, I also recommend this particular video over here, Human Evolution Evidence of Our Ancestors. So, it is a bit long, it is about 2 hours. So, it is not formally a part of this course, but I still want you to have a look at it because this gives a very nice idea about how scientists have gone about getting information from the fossils. How do you look for a fossil? Once you have figured out a fossil, how do you go from 1 or 2 bones to the entire reconstruction of how the particular species might have looked like? So, very, very nicely done. It is more about how scientists work, also gives you good information about what they have learned. So, once you look at all these videos, and I strongly recommend that you do it before you go forward, then you are going to have a reasonable idea of the various fossil forms. So, now what I will do is, I will give you the major milestones in human evolution, and some of these things are obviously covered in the videos that you are going to see, but many of these things are kind of taking off from the discovery of the fossils. So, the main meat of what I am going to talk about here is in these various milestones that we are going to now talk about. So, after the divergence from the chimpanzees, and as I told you, many hominin species arose, and very often multiple species coexisted, okay, both in terms of time and in terms of space. Now, the Homo fossils, that is the hominin line, they date to about 3 million years ago. So, that MYA is million years ago, and one of the earliest species was this thing called the Homo habilis, which made the simple tools, okay, many very, very simple tools. Then at some point from the Homo habilis arose the, okay, I should not say it arose from there, but this is the next Homo species for which we have very good records, fossil records. These are the so called Homo erectus. Now, this is the first hominin species which is believed to have a human like form. This is the species which is believed to have domesticated fire. They made way more complex stone tools compared to Homo habilis, and most importantly, this was the species that first came out of Africa. Remember, till this point everything is happening in Africa. This was the first species which is supposed to have migrated out of Africa. So, starting about 1.9 million years ago, the Homo habilis from Northeast Africa, they started migrating and they took multiple routes. So, first they came to the Middle East part, and then one went towards Europe, and then the other came towards India and Far East Asia. Now, while some populations did that, it is not that all Homo erectus left. Many other populations of Homo erectus, they continued to live and evolve in Africa. Then about 0.77 million years ago, which is about 770,000 years ago, there was a second wave of dispersal. Now, the second wave of dispersal, these are the people who were supposed to be the ancestors of the Neanderthals and the Denisovans. These are other hominin species. So, the Neanderthals, they went mainly towards Europe and towards Russia and the Siberian region. The Denisovans, they went mainly towards the Siberian region. I mean, till date, the only Denisovan fossils that have been found are from that region. Now, about 0.15 to 0.25 million years ago, the so called modern humans, Homo sapiens, they appeared in Africa. That is when we start getting their fossils from. Now, these Homo sapiens, I mean they were characterized by many things, the most important thing being very high brain size. So, or brain volume. So, if you look at the volume of the cranium, so this is where the early species Australopithecus were, and as you can see, over the time of over 3 to 4 million years, there was an exponential increase in the brain volume. Okay. So, modern mean is somewhere over here. So, this very high increase in the brain volume is one of the major characteristic features of the hominid line, not the hominid, sorry, hominin lineage. So, these modern humans, Homo sapiens, which arose in Africa, they first spread out of Africa between 0.18 to 0.27 million years ago. However, there were no descendants of these early migrants. Okay. So, we cannot find any of their traces in the genes of the extant species. About 70,000 years ago, which is 0.07 million years. So, from this point, instead of million, I am going to shift to thousands. So, 1000 is KY. So, about 70,000 years ago, genetic data tells us that a few thousand humans migrated to the Middle East from Africa in a single wave, which basically means this migration happened within a very short span of time. And then all the 7 billion plus people that you find on the surface of the earth today, all of them have descended from these these particular human beings who came out about 70,000 years ago out of Africa. And that means that the last of the colonization happened about 15,000 years back, 10-15,000 years back. So, which means that Homo sapiens colonized, starting from Africa, they colonized the entire planet within a space of about 55,000 years. Now, for us 55,000 years sound like a lot, but please remember that till this point we were talking about everything in terms of millions of years, right. So, 55,000 years geologically speaking is no less than a blink, and we have no evidence that any other animal has ever done such a thing. So, what was the route that they took? So, this is the Homo sapiens lineage. They first came out to Middle East, rather one group went towards Europe, and when they came out over here, the Neanderthals were still around. So, they ended up meeting the Neanderthals. I will talk about that later. Then one group that came to India, and then from India went towards Burma, Thailand, Indonesia, and then finally ended up in Australia about 65,000 years ago. There was another group which went towards Russia, northern Russia, another group which went towards China, and through China went towards Russia, and then about 25,000 years ago they ended up crossing from the Russia into the US. I mean, what is US these days? North America basically. And they could do that because the small or narrow Bering Strait which separates Asia from North America now, that point of time the Bering Strait was dry. So, these ancestors, they were able to cross over into North America, and then they came down the west coast, and then about 13,000 years ago they ended up getting towards the east coast, and another group ended up coming down towards Mexico, and then they crossed the Panama, and then about 12,000 years ago they ended up reaching South America, and then they spread slowly over South America. It took them about 3,000-4,000 years. So, North and South America got peopled in only 8,000 years, last 8,000 years. So, essentially the point I am trying to make is that this is the part which is known as the old world, this is the part which is known as the new world, and the point I am trying to make is that 70,000 years ago they started over here, and about 12-15,000 years ago they ended up reaching here. So, 55,000 years is what they needed to cover the entire surface of the planet. Now, remember, when all this is happening, when the Homo sapiens are spreading across the entire globe, other hominin species like the Neanderthals and the Denisovans are still around. So, the Homo sapiens, they ended up meeting all these species, they ended up coexisting with them, and we have excellent genetic data to believe that they even hybridized with them multiple times at many places. So, this is a map of the western Eurasia, and all these red circles, these are telling you the places where it is believed that there was mating and hybridization between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. So, you can see that it is over a very large zone. This is Denisova. This is this is where you have that cave from which the Denisovan species has been unearthed. And yeah, so these are some of the well known, well characterized, well, I shouldn't say well characterized, reasonably characterized based on genetic data, introgressions that have happened between the Homo sapiens and the Neanderthal and the Denisovan and potentially the Homo erectus lineage. You can see that it has happened many times in the past, and people think based on the data that many of these matings that have happened, these are more than one hybrid mating that we are talking about. Now, so there was a lot of genetic exchange, but after some time all the other hominin lineages went extinct. Only one hominin lineage remained, and that is the modern humans that we see, the Homo sapiens. So, although all these other lineages disappeared, some of the lineages, particularly the Neanderthals and the Denisovans, we have many signatures of their genomes in the modern humans. So, just to show you, a few representative chromosomes of humans, and here are a bunch of genes on various chromosomes. So, 3 genes for skin color, some gene for immune system on chromosome 12, genes for reduced cancer risk, adaptation to higher altitude. So, these are some of the many genes that we have in the sapiens genome, which we genetic data comparison with Neanderthal genomic sequences suggest that these are all genes of either Neanderthal or Denisovan origin. So, I will give you one quick example. This is a very famous example. So, we know that the Tibetans who they live on very high altitude under very cold low oxygen environments. Now, we know that when the oxygen level goes down, that is really bad for the physiology, which is why mountaineers often have to carry major oxygen cylinders on their back. Now, turns out that the Tibetans, even though they live in those high altitudes, they are actually extremely well adapted to that condition, and this is because of mutations in a particular gene known as the EPAS1 gene. Okay. Now, this EPAS1 gene, people have shown by comparing it with the Denisovan genome, is actually of Denisovan origin. So, somehow at some point there was an introgression, there was hybridization, and because of that, that gene came into the humans, and in the Tibetan population obviously there was a massive selection advantage, because of which the gene rose to extremely high frequency. So, people have compared it with the Han Chinese populations, and in the Han Chinese population the frequency of this gene is much lower. I mean, so is it in, let us say, European and other populations which also live in high altitudes. Somehow they never ended up getting the gene, simply because probably the Denisovans were much closer to where the modern Tibetan, much closer where the ancestors of the modern Tibetans were. Okay. So, while when all these things happened, when the humans they ended up getting to various parts of the world, obviously the climate and the local conditions in these various parts varied, and because of that there were several local adaptations that happened in the human population. So, if you remember, in week 1 we were looking at the variation that we find in human populations in terms of skin color, right? And we never explained why that variation came about, what is the reason behind it. So, what I will do is I will recommend a video, it is a part of the course called The Biology of Skin Color. So, it is a absolutely fascinating study about how the original humans who came out of Africa, they most probably had dark skins because of the African conditions, and how when they reached different parts of the world, the local condition changed, because of which their skin color had to change. So, it is very nicely done, very beautifully done. So, this information is going to be part of this course. Now, the other thing that happened was that at some point about 11,000 years ago, human beings invented agriculture. It was invented in the Middle East, but then independently over the next 1,000 years, it was invented in many other parts of the world. And in all these parts of the world, people ended up domesticating different crops, they ended up domesticating different kinds of animals. So, if you remember, we have already spoken about how maize was domesticated in South America. So, they also domesticated cucumbers, sweet potato, beans, peppers, etc. In India, we ended up domesticating millets, black grams, mung beans, etc. So, essentially people ended up having different kinds of food sources on top of their local conditions in different parts of the world. And when that happened, that led to a much greater diversity in terms of what people were eating, and that itself ended up putting a huge selection pressure on the local populations, corresponding to their respective environment. So, we have already seen one such example of this. So, if you remember, when we were talking about copy number variation, we saw that if you take those populations which are meat eating, they do not eat too much of starch, then they do not really need too many copies of the salivary amylase gene AMI1, whereas those populations, for example, the Japanese populations or the American populations which have a much greater amount of starch in their diet, they require more amount of amylase 1, and therefore, they have a much greater diversity of the copy number variation for this particular gene. So, that was one example. I will give you one or two more where in the last few thousand years there has been massive evolution in terms of the genes that the human populations possess. And the classic example of such a gene culture coevolution is lactose intolerance. So, many of you might have seen this sitcom called Big Bang Theory. So, this is one character from that, Leonard Hofstadter, and if you remember the it's a running joke that this guy is lactose intolerant, because of which he can't drink milk, and if he ends up drinking milk by chance, he has major flatulence, he is not able to digest, and so on. Now, very interestingly, although this is supposed to be a joke point or comedy point in this particular series, if you look at human adults, lactose intolerance is actually more common than the ability to digest lactose as an adult. Okay, remember, as a baby, all humans are able to digest lactose. If they cannot digest lactose, then obviously they will not be able to drink milk, and as we know, all human babies, they start their life with milk. But turns out that as we become adults, our ability to express the lactase gene, which breaks down lactose, goes down. And this is not a property of humans alone. It turns out that all mammals, all mammals are the organisms which drink milk, right? All mammals in the adult phase do not express the lactase enzyme, and therefore, they cannot digest milk. Good. But the interesting point is, there are some humans who can, right? And obviously, the question is, which set of humans can do that, and how is it that they are able to do it? And if you want the answer for that, I will recommend again a HHMI video, very nicely done, which will be, again, the information will be part of the course, where they end up showing how the primary set of people who are able to digest lactose are the ones who in the recent evolutionary history had taken to dairy farming. So, they had access to milk, and in the presence of milk there was some selection advantage to those mutations which enabled humans to digest milk. And interestingly, different populations in different parts of the world have independently evolved the mutations, and not the same mutation, different mutations, but the result is the same, that in those places where milk is a major part of the diet, they are actually able to digest the milk through that mutation. Very interestingly, there are other places where there is a lot of milk in the society, but they still can't digest the milk. Turns out that in many of those places they have culturally invented certain kinds of drinks which takes the milk and essentially gets rid of the lactose, and whatever comes out is lactose free and therefore digestible even by lactose intolerant people. I mean, for example, the kumis drink that you find in Mongolia. Okay, so this is about gene culture coevolution. Now, one of the questions that we are always asked, we as in the evolutionary biologists, are humans still evolving or have we stopped evolving? Now, obviously, right now human beings, we are primarily because of our culture, because of our technology, the pressure on our biology has reduced. However, turns out that does not mean that we have stopped evolving. Within the last 1000 years or less, there have been a lot of evolution that has happened in humans, and I am going to give you two examples, two very big and well known examples. So, the first example is this set of people known as the Bajau people, who are found in Philippines and Indonesia. So, these people, they are called sea nomads, and as you can see, they live in villages which are in the middle of the sea. Okay. So, they are essentially marine hunter gatherers. In other words, they hunt fish, they hunt for other things from the bottom of the sea, and they have been doing this for the last more than 1000 years without any specialized diving gears or anything. Okay, all they do is they put some kind of a goggles kind of a thing on their eyes, and that's it. They just what is known as free dive. Okay, they do the diving without using any specialized breathing apparatuses, and it is extremely well known that they are the best free divers in the world. They can dive deeper and they can live longer under the water, much longer compared to any other set of human beings on this planet. So, a normal diver, free diver, will be able to dive say about 4 to 5 meters. These guys will be able to go down 20 meters below the surface, and their ability to hold breath is much greater. More importantly, they can spend 4 to 8 hours of a day, obviously not continuously, but over the 24 hours they can spend 4 to 8 hours below water without any major adverse effects. If you and I are trying to do that, then we are most probably going to the hospital. Now, why is that? What exactly allows them to do that? So, turns out that there are many genetic changes that have happened in the Bajau people, but a major one is in terms of a mutation in a gene called the PDE10A, and this PDE10A mutation, it allows them to have a much larger spleen, okay, about 50% larger than other populations nearby, and it is a spleen which produces RBCs. So, the concentration of oxygenated RBCs in the blood of these guys is much greater. There are many other genetic changes as well. So, this is the paper which kind of figured out many of those changes. I will actually recommend that you go to the website of this paper. They have a very nice video where they not only show the Bajau people, but they also end up giving you very nice information about which are the other genes which have changed in these guys, and because of that how exactly the Bajau are able to spend so much time below the water. So, this is the first one. But as you can see, this is a kind of a situation where an existing trait, people have become better at that trait. It is not really talking about evolution of a new trait. So, the second example that I am going to give you of contemporary evolution is a situation where people have been able to get a new trait. And what is that? So, as you can see that this is sushi. Japanese in particular are very famous for eating this. And if you look at sushi, can you see this black wrapper over here? This is actually seaweed. This is called nori. Okay. Now, turns out that the Japanese, they consume an enormous amount of seaweed. I mean, it's an island nation, right? So, obviously, it is part of something that they get very easily. Now, not only in the form of sushi, but even in form of soup and many other things, they actually consume a huge amount of seaweed. Now, normal human beings cannot really digest seaweed, but turns out that some Japanese can actually digest the seaweed. Okay. How can they do that? That is because there has been a horizontal gene transfer from a marine bacteria called Zobelia galactanivorans to a human gut bacteria called Bacteroides plebeius. And because of this horizontal gene transfer, the genes that can digest the seaweed, now it has been transferred into a bacteria which lives inside the gut of the human. And the human beings, they are now passing this bacteria vertically from parent to the offspring. Now, because of this particular population and the individuals whose microbiota have this particular mutation, they are able to digest seaweed, which obviously means there is a new character that has evolved due to action of horizontal gene transfer on the microbiota. So, what this is telling us is that human evolution has not really stopped, and we are still able to do new things and very impressive things even within the last very few years, last 1000 years or so. Now, what is the take home message from this rather lot of information? So, the take home message is that when you normally think about human evolution, the picture that comes to your mind is something like this, right? You had this nice little monkey, and at some point it started becoming straighter and straighter, and then at some point the tools came in, and then you have this nice bipedally walking human. It's not a linear sequence like that. This is not how it happened. Okay. What human evolution is more accurately represented as is this diagram, where there were all kinds of branches that were happening, there were all kinds of gene exchanges that ended up happening, and finally it's more like a network, a very tangled mess rather than a neat sequence like this. Now, till this point we saw how humans have evolved both in ancient and in recent times. However, evolution is something which is not merely about the past, even not merely about the last 1000 years or so. There are several situations where evolution impinges upon our contemporary lives. I mean, we just lived through the pandemic, right? And if you remember, every few months or sometimes even faster, we were hearing about new lineages of virus, right? Delta, Omicron, and God knows what else, right? So that was a situation where evolution of that COVID virus happened right in front of our eyes. Okay, we paid the cost for that evolution. But even if we don't go in along that axis, there are many other ways in which evolution, evolutionary thinking, etc. impinges upon how we live our contemporary lives, and that is what we are going to discuss during our next week. See you then.